the Holy Spirit, Lord our God. Amen. Great present worship today. Thank you very much. And our message is the fourth and final in preparing for the promise. In Joshua chapter 5, starting verse 2. Just to recap, the first message is all about being in the presence of God. Reading His Word, praying, meditating on it. Because you have to hear what God has got for you before you can claim it. You have to get with the program. Like you can have a radio, but it doesn't help you much unless you tune in on a channel. The second message, of course, was about preparing. Preparing ourselves to do what we need to do. Because with the promise always comes responsibility. There's a promise and there's responsibilities to go with it. The third one, last week, was about facing the impossible. Because whenever God gives you a vision, it can't be done without Him. There's always an impossible element. Last week we spoke about that. The Jordan River was flowing. It was that time of year. It was overflowing. And they couldn't cross it. And God said, in 3 days we're going to cross. So it's like, you have to look at this, you have to look at this obstacle and say, God says in 3 days we're going to overcome it. And in the natural, I know that it's not going to happen. But do I believe God, or do I believe what everything around me says? This week is interesting because they've already crossed over Jordan, which is a type of baptism in the water, in the Holy Spirit. Now, they've crossed the river. They did the impossible. God stopped the water from flowing. They crossed over and they cross in. Now this is, you think, well, they're in the promised land now. It's all over. It's easy, right? No, it's not. In fact, they were busy fighting for 35 to 38 years and they still didn't get everything God had for them now. So it's like, what God's got for you, there's no limit to it. You can work all your life and you'll never get to the end of what God's got for you. Anyway, Joshua chapter 5, starting verse 2. They're on the other side of the Jordan. They're in the promised land now. And what happens? Verse 2. At that time the Lord said unto Joshua, make these sharp knives and circumcise again the children of Israel the second time. Well, it's not really the second time. The first time is good enough, but anyway. And Joshua made him sharp knives and circumcised the children of Israel at the hill of the foreskins. And this is the cause why Joshua did circumcise. All the people that came out of Egypt, that were males, even all the men of war, died in the wilderness, by the way, after they came out of Egypt. Now, all the people that came out were circumcised, and all the people that were born in the wilderness, they were there 40 years, by the way, as they came forth out of Egypt, them they had not circumcised. For the children of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness, till all the people that were men of war, which came out of Egypt, were circumcised, because they obeyed not the voice of the Lord, unto whom the Lord sware that He would not show them the land which the Lord sware unto their fathers, that He would give us, a land that flows with milk and honey. And their children, whom He raised up in their stead, them Joshua circumcised, for they were uncircumcised, because they had not been circumcised. They had not circumcised them in the way. And it came to pass, when they had done circumcising the people, that they abode in their places in the camp, till they were made whole. And the Lord said unto Joshua, this day have I rolled away the reproach of Egypt from off you. Wherefore the name of the place is called Gilgal unto this day. Now, so why is this important? Jordan was a natural barrier. They weren't going over in the natural, but in the other side, the people in Jericho weren't coming over either. They're protected in the natural. They're protected. But they cross over the river, and then He says, okay, all the guys got to get circumcised. But they're not in the promised land. They're in the land where the Canaanites, the Hittites, all of them, they're all there. All the people they're supposed to conquer are on the other side. And He says, now, all the guys got to be circumcised, which means they're not going to be moving around for a while. They're definitely not in fighting form. So why would you cross a river and then have them all vulnerable? And the answer is because, first of all, they're not vulnerable. God is protecting them. God had put the fear of God in all these unrighteous people. But it's important that they be circumcised after they cross the river, not before. Why? Well, because, like I said, the Jordan River, like I explained last week, is like the second baptism, the baptism in the Holy Spirit. They need that to go into the promise. You only need to be water baptized to come into the wilderness. But if you want to go into the promised land, you have to be baptized in the Holy Spirit. Why? Well, because that's where the power of God is manifest. The weapons of warfare are given to you in the Holy Spirit. And so you have to have that. You go into the promised land and you have to be circumcised. Why do you have to be circumcised? Well, because before you cross into the promise, once you get into the promise, you have to put away the flesh. You have to put away all the fleshly desires. It's like, well, now I can do this, now I can do that, and everything's like, but wait a minute, it was God that brought you into that promise. Don't you think He's got a plan? Well, He does. The fact is, you can still see the same thing today. People that seem normal and fine, and then they win the lottery, or they get rich in entertainment, or get rich in sports, and all of a sudden they go nuts, beating up their wives and doing drugs and stuff. It's like, what happened to these people? Their hearts were not circumcised. All of a sudden, they felt they were unrestrained, they could do whatever they wanted. But that's not true. It's a lie from hell. Because once you get more, doesn't mean that you can just do whatever you feel like. God gives you a promise so that you can handle the promise. You can't handle the promise in the flesh, you have to be in the Holy Spirit. That's why you have to give up, you have to explicitly give up the flesh. More importantly, you're actually giving it back to God. You're giving the promise back to God. You come into the promise, you say, God, I got this because you gave it to me, not because I worked for it. You gave me this promise. And I have to give it back to you. Not just in the sense of, I'll get on that in a minute, in terms of giving it back to God, but in terms of my flesh, it's like I understand that in my own flesh, I'm going to make a mistake, just like Adam and Eve in the garden. Oh, this looks like a good idea. Well, just because it looks like a good idea does not make it a good idea. How do I avoid bad ideas that look like good ideas? I guess we come back to the Holy Spirit, crossing through Jordan. And he says the reproach of Egypt is the very thing that they're getting circumcised for. The reproach of Egypt is all about me first. It's all about having more toys, more money, more power, more fame, more. That's the reproach of Egypt. It's all about me. Now we go down to verse 10. And the children of Israel encamped in Gilgal, and kept the Passover on the 14th day of on the month at even in the plains of Jericho. It's like, you come into the new promise doesn't mean that you still don't have your usual obligations. Some people think, that's not my people anymore. I don't have to worry about my family. They're not where I'm at. They don't understand. It's like, they probably do better than you do. You don't forget about your friends. You don't forget about your family. You don't forget about your relationship with God. So the Passover was fundamental to being a believer. It was God's salvation bringing people out of Egypt. And God brought us out of Egypt. God brought us out of the world. We can't forget about our Christianity simply because life is good. And they did eat of the old corn in the land on the morrow after the Passover, unleavened cakes and parched corn in the selfsame day. And the manna ceased on the day after they had eaten of the old corn of the land. Neither had the children of Israel manna any more, but they did eat of the fruit of the land in Canaan that year. Why is that important? God provided food for them supernaturally 40 years in the desert. The manna that they collected every morning. And they cooked with it, they did whatever with it, but he provided them food every day. Once they came to the promise, he said, there's no more food feeding. You got to go get your own food. Nothing wrong with that, but it's all about discipline. We still have to, you know what? You can win $1 million, and the day after, all you guys, you still got to put on your pants the same way, one leg at a time. You're not something special because you have more money. And it's like, okay, God's provision, he's got a new provision for you. There's a new thing going on here. The old is gone, and he started something new. We'll go to the next and last part of the message. And that is chapter 6, verse 17. Now here they are, after 3 days, week, whatever time it is. The guys are all healed up. They're in the promised land. The next thing is starting to take the land, right? Verse 17, and the city, which is Jericho, shall be accursed, even it and all that are therein, to the Lord. Only Rahab, the harlot, shall live, she and all her house that were with her in the house, because she had hid the messengers that we sent. And you in any wise keep yourselves from the accursed thing, lest ye make yourselves accursed. When you take of the accursed thing, and make the camp of Israel a curse, and trouble it. But all the silver, and the gold, and the vessels of brass and iron, are consecrated unto the Lord. They shall come into the treasury of the Lord. This is interesting for another reason. He said, okay, everything in it, men, women, children, animals, everything's got to die. But all the gold, the silver, all the valuables, they go to the church. They go into the tabernacle. Now, I used to think of this as a classic case of tithing. You tithe the first one, and then everything after that is theirs. But it's not. That isn't really the issue. The issue is this. When you come into the promise of God, I've spoken before, you have to give it all back to God. Now, I'm not talking about giving up your fleshly desires. That's a whole different issue. But you literally give back to God what he's given you. Oswald Chambers has spoken about this quite a bit. The fact is, it has to be sanctified. If you don't sanctify it, then it becomes a curse. So, God didn't explain this all, but he does in the New Testament. You give it back to God, and what God has given you, when you give it back to him, it becomes sanctified, it becomes holy, and it becomes a blessing. But I got to give it all away. Yeah, but you're going to get more. You'll get a lot more than that. All the cities after that, another 38 cities after that, God gave them everything. Well, that to me sounds like a whole lot less than a tithe. But that's irrelevant. They gave it all back to God. They did what they're supposed to. Actually, there was one exception. That's a whole different issue. But they gave it back to God, and it became a blessing because they were following the purpose of God. What's the whole purpose? The whole purpose of this, preparing for what God has for you, preparing for the promise. We all have promises. If you get into the Holy Spirit, you can hear what God is promising you. You can't be daunted by the fact that it looks impossible. That's why it's God's vision. We can always aim for something that's possible in the flesh. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you really want God's best for your life, you have to get into the Holy Spirit and receive the fullness of what he's got for you, which is much, much more than you ever consider. Isaiah said so. Eye hath not seen, neither ear heard, neither has it been conceived in the heart of man, the things that God has prepared for those that love him. So he'll give you a challenge that's everything you can handle. But he'll give you a blessing that's even more than you can handle. It's everything, a complete and total blessing. Not just wealth and stuff, but it's health. It's peace, it's joy, it's peace with your family, peace with your friends, joy. It's it's comprehensive. It's everything, and that's what it's all about. It's all about receiving the blessing. And why am I preaching on this now? Well, because this is one of those times when God's moving. Some of you have felt that. Some of you know it. Some of you know it by experience. Things going on. But now is the time. It's not always that God is always moving, but there are certain dispensations in the timing of God where he does something more, does something extra. We have the option of listening, or we have the option of doing our own thing. But he is moving, and I want to encourage you. Even if you haven't started yet, it doesn't matter. Tune in. It's never too late. And that's my message today. I do want